In this video, we're going to look at the maintenance of blood glucose levels. We're going to cover what glucose is. We're going to look at glycogen as the way that glucose is stored in the body. We're going to talk about the hormones that control glucose levels in the blood. We'll go through a feedback loop for glucose levels and briefly talk about diabetes as a disease that affects glucose levels. Glucose is another chemical that is required for respiration by all the cells in the body. Because they require this glucose, it means that we need a constant supply of glucose in the blood, and if the supply drops too low, it can cause problems. Conversely, if the glucose levels in the blood get too high, it can also cause problems. And these levels are maintained through homeostasis. Glucose levels in the blood rise naturally after eating, and then during fasting periods between eating, drop back down to baseline levels. Glycogen is the way that excess glucose is stored by the body. It's converted from glucose to glycogen in a process called glycosynthesis. And that glycogen is stored in fat cells in the liver as well as in muscle tissue. Glucose levels in the blood are controlled by two hormones. Insulin, which stimulates a process called glycosynthesis, which turns glucose into glycogen, and glucagon, which stimulates a process called glycogenolysis, which turns glycogen back into glucose. We'll now have a look at the feedback loop related to glucose regulation. So the first one is the increase in blood glucose, whether from eating or from an inability for the body to regulate itself properly. The chemoreceptors are the receptors that recognize that there is too much glucose in the blood. The control center in this case is the pancreas, and to an extent also the hypothalamus. They recognize that the glucose levels are too high, and the pancreas releases the hormone insulin. Insulin stimulates the glucose synthesis, which turns glucose into glycogen, which brings our glucose levels in the blood back down to our homeostatic level. The opposite can also occur when there's a drop in blood glucose. The chemoreceptors again pick this up. The pancreas and hypothalamus signal for the pancreas to release glucagon. Glucagon stimulates the process of glycogenolysis, which turns the glycogen back into glucose, releasing it into the blood, bringing our glucose to normal levels. Diabetes is a disease where the body is no longer able to control the amount of blood glucose. There are two things that can happen to a diabetic. One, they can go into hypoglycemia, where they don't have enough sugar in the blood, and a way to treat this would be to give the person some sweet food, usually jelly beans or something like that, and the sugar in that will, once it gets into the bloodstream, increase the amount of sugar in the blood. And the other thing that can happen is hyperglycemia, when a person has too much sugar in the blood, and the only way to control this is through an insulin injection, which will then bring those blood glucose levels back down. In this video, we've looked at glucose, we've looked at glycogen as the way that glucose is stored in the blood, we've looked at the two hormones that control the process of turning glucose and glycogen backwards and forwards from and to one another, and that is insulin and glucagon. We've looked at the feedback loop for what happens when there is too much sugar in the blood, which releases insulin to bring it back down, and too little sugar or glucose in the blood, which releases glucagon to bring it back up. And we've looked at diabetes, which can be either hypoglycemic diabetes or hyperglycemic diabetes.